Hi, everyone. Okay, I'm going to start my presentation.
All right, welcome everyone. I just want to maybe encourage folks who are drinking coffee and talking about non-duality to do it in a very dual state in the hallway. Talking to you, Dave Vago. We have a exciting session with 5 talks, so we really need to respect all the speakers' time, and we're gonna get started here. So welcome and thanks very much.
Okay, today I'll be presenting a study I collaborate with Dan Barry and my advisor, Kirk Brown, examining the effects of mindfulness meditation and compassion meditation, parochial empathy and prosocial behavior toward an ethnic outgroup. So why are group boundaries contextual barriers to empathy? So 2 theories can provide explanation for this phenomenon. So first, the social identity theory states that individuals are biased to favor their in-groups, so the social group they identify with, over out-groups, so those are the other social groups, to maintain a positive social identity. And building upon the social identity theory, the integral emotions theory states that individuals experience group-based emotions based on their social identities, which can predict behavioral tendencies toward out-groups. Importantly, empathy, which include components of experience sharing and empathic concern, also operate like group-based emotion. So parochial empathy is the people's differences in willingness and ability to empathize with in-group members over out-group members. So people's tendency to have more empathy toward in-group members over out-group points to the need to examine ways to overcome contextual barriers to empathy and cultivate empathy when it's difficult, such as in integral contexts where there's conflict and animosity. So mindfulness training has been shown to increase prosocial behavior in various social contexts. So it has been shown to increase donation toward nonprofit organization, collaboration, and also increase helping behavior toward racial outgroup members. As well, extended programs that incorporate a mindfulness component has been shown to promote conflict resolution and increase peace building. So a 8-week mindfulness-based program conducted by Al-Kobi and colleagues in 2017 showed that in the context of Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Israeli participants who participate in the 8-week mindfulness stress reduction show increased support for conciliatory policies that will reduce the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as compared to the waitlist control group. And 10-minute mindfulness meditation has also been shown to decrease implicit biases such as prejudice and also decrease discrimination toward racial outgroups. So how might mindfulness work to enhance intergroup prosociality, given that people can be resistant to appeals for intergroup prosociality? So Barry and colleagues suggest that mindfulness meditation practices can cultivate an empathic attention set, so people attend receptively to the needs of others without an overlay of social identities, appraisals, and attitudes. So compassion meditation has been widely used to study the effects of contemplative practices on prosocial response, given its explicit instruction to cultivate compassion. So adult meta-analysis comparing mindfulness meditation and compassion meditation shows similar effects on prosocial outcomes. Few studies has directly compared the effects of these 2 types of meditation to examine whether these practices promote intergroup prosociality and how they operate. So investigating how mindfulness and compassion meditation influence intergroup prosociality may complement current efforts to reduce intergroup conflict, and especially, so this is the goal of their present study, to examine how these 2 types of training can impact the conflict between Americans and non-US Arabs. So the present study, we first hypothesized that non-Arab Americans in the mindfulness condition and the compassion condition will show less parochial empathy toward non-US Arabs than participants in the relaxation control condition. And second, we hypothesized that the mindfulness condition and the compassion condition will promote prosocial behavior toward Arab outgroups significantly more than the relaxation control condition. And lastly, we hypothesized that parochial empathy will predict the relation between condition and prosocial behavior toward non-US Arabs better than trait empathic concern. So this is other-oriented emotions for those who are in need. This is also called compassion. So we've recruited participants through the online platform Prolific. We recruited for 450 participants. And on average, most participants were in early middle age, and about half the participants identify as women. Most participants identify as white. So I'll be going over the procedure of this study. After giving consent, participants were presented with a cover story for the research. They were told that they were playing in the English-speaking team against Arabic-speaking team, a problem-solving challenge, and the first team to accumulate a score of 100 points will win the challenge. Then participants were randomly assigned to 3 conditions: the mindfulness condition, compassion meditation condition, or the relaxation control condition. So for the parochial empathy measure, participants read 16 events, positive and negative, that's experienced by the in-group, so that's the English-speaking team members, and the out-group, so the Arabic-speaking team members. And they were told to measure how good or bad they feel about these events. So here I give example for the in-group member. And here's an example for the out-group. Then participants indicated their social identification using these Venn diagrams. So after participants have played these 8 progressive Ravens matrix problem to support the cover story, they listen to a brief 1-minute booster induction. And then next for the out-group alternate task, participants were given the choice to either continue solving up to the 20 or more problems or up and skip to the next task. They were told that for each additional problem they correctly solve, we would donate 50 cents to this nonprofit organization. Then participants answered questions assessing support for Arab immigration and support for out-group cause. And then they also completed mindfulness meditation checks, audio recording checks, and also trait measures, demographic questions. So all the instruction condition lasted 10 minutes. One female instruction who's naive to the research question recorded all the scripted intervention audio tracks. And the intervention would match in duration, complexity, setup, and ending. So the mindfulness meditation was a type of focused attention meditation, which used the breath as the anchor. And this training does not include any prosocial related terms. And the compassion meditation asks participants to cultivate compassion for oneself and for close other, and then towards strangers and all humanity. So this is a loving kindness meditation. And the relaxation control condition use a progressive muscle relaxation. So because the effects of these 10-minute mindfulness and compassion meditation are very ephemeral, one booster induction, which is like 1 minute, matching each condition, was included partway through the study. So participants in all 3 conditions completed the following measures. Parochial empathy was assessed by the difference between how good participants feel about in-group and out-group's fortunate events, and how bad they feel about in-group and out-group's misfortunate events. And then 3 measures were included to assess prosocial behavior. So out-group altruism was measured by the additional problems that participants choose to complete to support the Arab nonprofit organization. And support for out-group immigration was measured by the percent of visas participants granted to the Arab social group among 5 other social groups, so East Asians, Hispanics, Africans, and Eastern Europeans. And support for out-group cause was measured by the distribution of a bonus fund, so 50 cents, between in-group costs, so those COVID relief fund for people in the US, and out-group costs, so bonus relief fund, COVID relief fund for people in Syria. And then we also include this list of covariates. So trait presence was measured by the mass scale, and trait empathy was measured by the empathic concern subscale and the personal distress subscale of the interpersonal reactivity index. And then social identification was measured by the inclusion of in-group and out-group in the self-measure. So those were the Venn-like diagram you saw before. And we also measure integral contact quantity and quality. So this measured previous contact with the Arab out-group. And we also check for mindfulness, people's attentiveness, fatigue, and serenity while they were listening to the audio recording checks. And the audio recording check also assess audio quality. So in the ANCOVA model, we use in-group empathy as covariate. So this adjusts using different score, the problem with using a different score. And there's in the ANCOVA model show that there's a significant effect of condition on out-group empathy after controlling for in-group empathy. So mindfulness group show a mean score of 0.14 higher than the relaxation group. And the compassion group also show a mean score of 0.21 higher than the relaxation group. And we also ran a Zheng and ANCOVA model which include all the queries I showed before. And only participants receiving compassion instructions show lower progo empathy. And to account for the bimodal distribution of the algo altruism, this outcome was analyzed using a zero-inflated Poisson model. So the results show that relative to the control group, mindfulness training increased the likelihood of engaging in algo altruism, and relative to the control group, participation in the compassion condition did not increase the likelihood of engaging in algo altruism. So the second question asks whether mindfulness or compassion group will show greater prosocial behavior toward support for IRA immigration than the relaxation group. So ANCOVA model, including all the covariates, show that there's a significant effect of condition for IRA immigration after controlling for the covariates. So mindfulness group show a mean score of 1.72 points higher than the relaxation group. And in this model, empathic concern, algo identification, intergroup contact quality, age, and political viewpoint are also significant predictors. So the support for algo cause has a multimodal distribution. So I use a k-means clustering algorithm was used to support to split the outcome into 3 groups. So the give up group is the group that give all the monetary fund, the 50 cents to the algo cause. And the keep group was those who keep all the fund or most of the fund for the in-group. And the free play group is those who distribute the fund evenly between the in-group cost and the out-group cost. And actually most of the participants choose to split the cost, the fund evenly. And the multinomial logistic regression using the keep group as the reference group showed that the logout of being one group versus another did not differ across conditions. So there's not effect of condition on this outcome. So hierarchical regression model regress support for IRA immigration on trait empathic concern in the first block, followed by program the second block, show that adding program empathy to the model did not increase the model fit. And trait empathic concern was a significant predictor of support for IRA immigration. Program empathy was not a significant predictor. And for the second outcome, algo altruism, we used the zero-inflated Poisson model to account for the bimodal distribution. And we included program empathy and trait empathic concern as covariates. So program empathy decreased the likelihood of engaging in algo altruism, whereas trait empathic concern increased the likelihood of engaging in algo altruism. So this is this present study differs from prior compassion research in that it's among the first to examine how mindfulness meditation and compassion meditation influence intergroup emotions, not merely interpersonal emotions, and examine how it influences prosocial behavior toward our group members. So for the first hypothesis, the mindfulness meditation and compassion meditation both show less program empathy than the relaxation control condition. However, if we account for all the covariates, only the compassion meditation show less. The people who practice compassion meditation show less program empathy. And although compassion meditation, those who practice compassion meditation show less program empathy, it doesn't seem to have an effect on actual prosocial behavior. So this is a surprising finding, but it does support research in social psychology. So explicit appeals to cultivate compassion for our group, especially when there's a historical or current conflict with our group, can be met with psychological resistance. And although mindfulness training and compassion training doesn't seem to affect support for algo cause, mindfulness training seems to enhance algo altruism and support for algo immigration. And lastly, program empathy and trait empathic concern both predicted algo altruism, but only trait empathic concern predicted support for algo immigration. So this study has several limitations. Given that there's a lack of passive no instruction control condition, the alternative explanation that the relaxation effect of the control condition could reduce program empathy and promote prosocial behavior to our group cannot be ruled out. And it's important to consider present results in the context of current social political events and the demographics of the participants. So given that the average age of the participants were around 39 years old, they face a long list of socio-political challenges. So for example, the Afghanistan war and the current war in Ukraine, which can dampen post-social responses toward the Arab outgroup. And most of the participants in this sample identify as white. So this relative lack of diversity in this sample limits the regionalizability of the results to other racial or ethnic groups. So who might respond differently to the parochial empathy and post-social behavioral measures in this study. So although there were mixed findings for the effects of mindfulness meditation and compassion meditation on parochial empathy, more research is needed to examine how mindfulness and compassion meditation impact changes in intergroup emotions, given the important role that emotions play in intergroup conflict. So people experience group-based emotions based on their social identity, which can predict and motivate their behavior toward racial ethnic outgroups. So this is necessary to further examine intervention-related changes in intergroup emotions and how that impact intergroup behaviors. And future research should also examine social cognitive mechanisms mutable to meditation practices. So for example, social categorization, attribution, and implicit attitude bias, and how change in these mechanisms influence post-social outcomes in intergroup contexts. So this study is my master thesis project. So I want to thank my committee member, Dr. Gabrielle Johnson, on her constructive feedback, and also Dr. Polina Beloborodova, who will be presented in the afternoon on her guidance on data analysis in R. And I also want to thank my lab members and research assistants in the Wellbeing Lab who helped set up the study.
Thank you for the presentation. It was very clear. I was also intrigued by the difference between mindfulness intervention and the compassion intervention with respect to actual prosocial behavior. And I'm wondering whether, I mean, I can understand, you know, one way of understanding the mindfulness intervention having an effect on the prosocial behavior is perhaps through some kind of inhibition of the biases that might be operating, so which perhaps manifest in the form of actual action. But in relation to compassion meditation, one clarification I would like to ask you is the intervention itself is primarily a loving kindness meditation, yeah?
Yes.
So that might make a difference because loving kindness tend to focus more on wishing someone well.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you have an explicit compassion, I mean, within the compassion meditation broadly, you can see two main types. One is loving kindness emphasizes more on the wishing someone well. Whereas if you have an explicit compassion protocol, then there is a kind of an explicit emphasis also on the suffering and also elevation of suffering. And then Tonglen is a kind of a priming to actually act out on that impulse to help. So I'm wondering whether some of that has to do with the specific type of compassion intervention that you did, which is primarily loving kindness. Any idea you have?
Yeah, I think what you mentioned about like how it doesn't only cultivate like warm wishes, maybe the intentions back. That's why I think it showed effect on parochial empathy because
Yes.
the emotions, whereas maybe the other compassion meditation we have talked about actually the focus on behavior might have an impact on the actual behavior outcomes. And it's interesting how to see like how this impact on the emotion doesn't really translate to impact in actually like post-social outcomes.
Yes.
So people can indicate that who practice compassion meditation can show that like they actually feel good or like for a fortunate event that happened to our groups and feel bad for unfortunate event that happened to our group, but then they actually want to support the outgroup behaviorally.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Hi, first of all, I would like to thank you all for attending this Saturday morning session. My name is Madhura. I'm a postdoc at Ohio State University, and I work with Dr. Ruchika Prakash and her incredible clinical neuroscience lab team. And I'm presenting some data from my dissertation study that was done at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. So I'm going to be talking about the efficacy of a remote yoga intervention on improving positive psychological well-being. So I'm going to start by talking about positive psychological well-being. So it is a broad term referring to positive emotions such as happiness, worth, purpose, etc. And initially we thought that distressful emotions such as stress, anxiety, depression, and positive psychological well-being are two sides of the same coin. So if you had stress, anxiety, or depression, you could not have positive psychological well-being. And if you had positive psychological well-being, it just implied that it was an absence of stress, depression, anxiety, etc. But a review by Riff and colleagues in 2006 showed that that's actually not the case. Both of these are distinct and interrelated constructs. And positive psychological well-being has independent effects on health. So it's been independently shown to have a lower risk of cardiovascular disease. It's been shown to predict lesser symptoms of depression, lesser salivary cortisol, and also higher engagement in physical activity, better sleep quality, and better dietary intake. One of the ways that we could improve positive psychological well-being is through the practice of yoga. Yoga means the union of mind and body, and it's a contemplative mind-body practice wherein attention is directed inwards. So you're focusing on how you're feeling, you're focusing on your breathing, and you're focusing on your body postures. It also has an aspect of non-judgment, since participants are encouraged to participate or perform these poses at the ability that they're comfortable with. And also many modifications are suggested to their yoga poses. The practice of yoga typically involves 8 limbs, but most commonly, yoga programs and interventions have focused on 3 limbs, which is postures, breathing, and meditation. So I'm going to highlight some research that has been done on yoga and psychosocial factors. And you'll see that a lot of it has been done with distressful emotions or distressful states, such as stress, anxiety, depression, neuropsychiatric disorders. All of these are systematic review and meta-analyses. But up until 2018, only 5% of the studies had focused on positive psychological well-being as an independent construct. Additionally, most research has focused on low-intensity hatha yoga postures. And there is growing consensus among researchers regarding the need for exploring different types of yoga. And one such unexplored aspect of yoga is sun salutations. These are beginner-friendly, and poses are usually linked together. They are usually of moderate intensity. They're fast-paced and dynamic, and movement is coordinated with breath. So, for example, in the first pose, you would inhale. In the next pose, you would exhale, and so on and so forth throughout the sequence. So even if you are engaging in moderate intensity exercise, the attention is really directed inwards. So given the lack of research on different aspects of yoga, as well as positive psychological well-being, we examined the efficacy of an 8-week moderate intensity or a sun salutation yoga intervention on improving positive psychological well-being. And we were also interested in looking at how anxiety contributes to this relationship. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the intervention. We recruited participants through email newsletters. They did about 1 hour of remote baseline testing. Then they were randomized into a yoga group or a waitlist control group, followed by a 8-week remote yoga intervention and post-testing. In terms of the yoga intervention, participants engaged in 3 sessions per week that lasted about 50 minutes. And each session started with a warming up, followed by about 40 minutes of sun salutation movements, followed by breathing and relaxation. And this intervention progressively became more and more difficult. So for example, in the first week, participants did sun salutations from Hatha Yoga and deep breathing. But by week 8, they were doing sun salutations B and more advanced forms of breathing like alternate nostril breathing. So this was just an example of sun salutation B, which participants were engaging in towards the end of the intervention. We also titrated the intervention in terms of how much supervision was provided to them. So in week 1, our certified yoga instructor had one-on-one sessions with each of the participants to help them understand the postures better and to suggest modifications, as well as resolve any technological issues. For week 2, all of the participants engaged in 3 group sessions. For weeks 3 to 5, all of the participants engaged in 1 group session at the beginning of the week, and then they were asked to do 2 sessions on their own at any time that was comfortable to them. And we provided videos from the class to facilitate that practice. And from weeks 6 through 8, we encouraged them to do all of the sessions on their own, and we provided, again, class videos to encourage or to guide their practice. We assessed positive psychological well-being with a couple of well-validated measures. So we assessed mindfulness, optimism, self-compassion, and affect. And we also assessed anxiety. And this was assessed at the beginning of the intervention and after 8 weeks. We included participants who were full-time working adults between the ages of 18 to 64, and they had to be low active, so they could not engage in regular physical activity or any mindfulness practices, and they were beginners to yoga. So we excluded anybody who had considerable yoga experience in the past 10 years. This is the consort just showing how our enrollment went along. So we had 86 participants, and they were randomized into one of the 2 groups, and almost all of our participants completed the study, which is great for us. Most of our participants were female. They were middle-aged on average. Most of them were white, non-Hispanic, and Latino. They had advanced or college degrees, and most of them were UIUC employees, which is not entirely surprising considering we advertised a lot in UIUC newsletters that go on to staff and faculty members. And this study was done during the pandemic, and we had a tough time figuring out how to reach out to the community in the absence of being able to put up flyers or go to public events. So this is data showing how the attendance went along across the 8 weeks. So for the supervised sessions, including the one-on-one orientation sessions and group classes, we had great attendance at 97%. And for the self-guided sessions, it fell a little bit, which was expected. And we had an average of 63% attendance. We had only 1 adverse event in the yoga group. And their mean heart rate across the 8 weeks suggests that it was a moderate intensity intervention for them. In terms of assessing positive psychological well-being, we did an exploratory factor analysis to examine whether all of these constructs load on to a single latent factor or we should analyze them separately. And all of them loaded onto a single latent factor. So we went ahead with positive psychological well-being as a single construct. We did a path analysis. So our first hypothesis was to examine whether engaging in this yoga intervention contributes to positive psychological well-being, and we found a significant effect for that. And our second hypothesis was examining how anxiety or a change in anxiety mediates this relationship. And we found partial mediation for this relationship, which means that engaging in yoga increased positive psychological well-being, in part due to a reduction in anxiety. But we still found independent effects of yoga that went over and above a reduction in anxiety in terms of contribution to positive psychological well-being. So it really goes back to highlight that these are distinct constructs and we should explore both of them. Most yoga interventions have usually been done in person, which has a lot of benefits in terms of having a community and a mindful space that you can do your practice in. So it was interesting to see that our remote intervention also had some benefits to positive psychological well-being in the absence of all of those factors. Of course, some limitations that must be kept in mind while interpreting these results. One is that we did not have an active control group. We were initially intending to have an aerobic exercise group, but logistically it just wasn't possible in the pandemic. And we had a pretty homogeneous sample again, because we could not reach community members. Some future directions is to examine positive psychological well-being in yoga interventions as an independent construct, and to examine how different styles and components of yoga can contribute to this construct. For example, maybe a Kripalu yoga intervention would be able to enhance positive well-being even better. And also to understand the mechanisms behind what contributes to these increases. So lastly, I just want to bring you all to this figure that we saw at the beginning of the presentation, showing that these are distinct and interrelated constructs, and our results do support this hypothesis. So just concluding by saying more and more studies can try and assess positive psychological well-being, and there are unique and direct effects of yoga on this construct. I want to thank NASPA for funding the study with their graduate student research grant, and all of the members of the Exercise, Technology, and Cognition Lab who really made the study possible and just contributed incredibly to it. And I'm happy to take questions if there's time, or happy to chat later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa Eiler from the Sanford Institute for Empathy and Compassion. Great study, wonderful presentation. I'm just wondering about the magnitude of the change in positive well-being, because one of the things that we've seen in some of our studies is that the instruments are very trait-like, so they pull for kind of how you usually are. And so with interventions, sometimes it's hard to make that move because people sort of have a pretty fixed idea of how they are in terms of their well-being. So just curious about how much change did you see, what was, and how clinically meaningful or sort of relevant to people's lives do you think the amount of change you saw was?
So that's a great question. We did see a small effect size. It wasn't a big effect size. And in terms of clinical significance, I'm not sure if positive well-being is assessed clinically. For example, with stress and anxiety, we have clinical measures that have cutoffs where you can say whether it's a subclinical sample or a clinical sample, but we really don't have that with positive well-being. So we did see a small effect size, and I think it's interesting to go ahead and figure out, what could contribute more to increasing positive psychological well-being and having a bigger impact on that. I hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. Really great to be here today. And I'm Jyoti Mishra. I lead the NEAT labs at UC San Diego. And today I'm going to present to you work on brief digital mindfulness and compassion for medical trainees. This work has been funded by the Sanford Institute for Empathy and Compassion. So really grateful for their support for this work. Okay, so NEAT Labs is a highly integrated space where we bring in neuroscientists, engineers, and clinicians to work together on aspects of mental health, and we develop technologies that can promote mental health and well-being, and we support the values of equality and diversity and inclusivity in the lab. The work today has been spearheaded by postdoctoral fellows Satish Jaiswal and also research associates Susie and James and graduate student Jason Nan, he's named James here, and Nihal, who's an undergraduate student with us. Okay, so I'll give you a background of the work, the training intervention that we developed for the study, the exact study design, which is very similar to the work presented by the two previous speakers, and then we'll go into the results conclusions. Medical trainees, as well as physicians, have high burnout in the workplace. And in fact, this burnout is actually much higher than what is present in other work fields. And the pandemic obviously aggravated this so that physicians have reported high emotional pain, insomnia, and depression. And during this time, we got really interested in how we can help with this problem. We were in the School of Medicine, and so we put together this study. Previous work by West et al. Here did a meta-analysis of 15 randomized controlled studies and showed that mindfulness can be helpful for physician work-related stress. And here is a graph showing that work done in physicians themselves, that mindfulness greatly relates to fulfillment as a positive correlate, whereas it negatively correlates with burnout, and as shown here. So the challenges that exist in the field is that while we know the benefits of mindfulness, it is not part of existing medical curriculum in many places. And a big barrier for medical trainees, especially, is that they have insufficient time for this kind of training, and they have a lot of intensive classes going on. And so we leverage our digital intervention tools for the study. They can be engaged with flexibly in one's own time. And in prior work, we've shown them to be have high adherence as well as high scalability. So it doesn't have to be limited to your own institution. Although in this work, this is pilot work, so we did it at UC San Diego. So we developed this WellMind training app, and what it had were three simple elements. One was focused on breathing, very simple breathing exercises where inhale in and breathe out. Alongside the breathing, we also had compassion training prompts that were provided just as instruction at the beginning of each day's schedule. After this about 5 to 10 minute segment of breathing, there was a very brief reflect segment as well. And then they did gratitude in terms of how grateful they were feeling for the day. Overall, it takes about 5 to 10 minutes total to interact with the digital modules, and individuals had access to up to 60 sessions for about a 3-month time period. This is just in more detail what the breathing and the other modules consisted of. In this one, the instruction is just close your eyes naturally and close your eyes and breathe naturally. Tap after each breath or a sequence of breaths. So the taps that you close your eyes, you have your digital screen, and you're just doing a little tap with your finger on the screen. And if you do this consistently, we were monitoring performance, and over time, the sequence, the number of breaths that one had to monitor at any given time was increased. And this is how we made it what we call a closed loop breathing exercise, that depending on how consistent your performance is, the challenge level goes up. At the same time, like I mentioned in the previous slide, there were 10 levels that are part of compassion cultivation practice that were provided as instruction right before the breathing exercise itself. So for example, on level 2, there would be a brief instruction and that you should, while doing the breathing practice, also think about a loved one and compassion for a loved one. Then it moved on to compassion for oneself, and then compassion, loving kindness for oneself, and thinking about others beyond yourself and the loved one, so others as well, and overall working towards more active compassion. The reflect exercise simply had 10 prompts every day, where every day you just get one prompt, and every week there would be that same prompt. So for example, a positivity prompt would say, who or what made you smile? And they would type in a brief answer to that question. And these 10 prompts are developed based on reflection-based prompts that have been validated in the literature. And finally, they rated their level of gratitude. And again, the reminder is that we were able to complete each daily session within a 5 to 10 minute time period. So study design in this case was that at baseline, we had behavioral assessments as well as neurophysiological assessments. We had the group that was doing the WellMind app engagement. We had 22 individuals in that, and then a no contact control group or a waitlist group that did not engage with the WellMind technology. Finally, we repeated the baseline assessments and also did a follow-up at about 3 months to 6 months time period on the behavioral aspects of the training. So our hypotheses were that because the training included aspects of breath work and attention to breathing, then mindfulness and compassion behaviors would be improved in the WellMind training group. We also noted that the degree of training engagement should be associated with the behavioral improvements. The degree of the intensity of the behavioral improvements that are seen should be related to how much engagement is present. In the neurophysiology, we were especially interested in the suppression of the default mode network ruminative activity and whether that is observed, because that has been shown to be suppressed in other studies of mindful meditation as well. So we especially hypothesized plasticity of this network. And finally, we wanted to look at whether the changes in the brain networks relate to the behavioral improvements. We specifically looked at 3 networks in cognitive control. These are the main networks that are present: the frontoparietal network, which is for on-task, goal-directed, moment-to-moment attention; the singular opercular network, which is more for on-task sustained attention; and finally, the default mode network, which is for more distracted processing and needs to be suppressed. The basic demographics are laid out here. The 2 groups did not have any differences between their age, gender, ethnicity, or trait mindfulness and self-compassion starting out. We had about 40% Caucasian inclusion, and then other ethnicity groups were also present, as is true for the population here in San Diego. So in terms of results, there was wide variation, but here we're looking at the differences that are observed post-training and also follow-up at about 3 to 6 months later. And in both cases, the WellMind group was able to show improvements in, here we're seeing self-compassion. The control group did not show these improvements. And the WellMind group also showed improvements in state mindfulness, specifically at the post-assessment point, but not at the follow-up assessment point. The number of training sessions that were engaged, these are the 22 participants shown on the x-axis, and the number of sessions that were engaged are shown on the y-axis by the different individuals. These are sorted by more training sessions engaged. And here, as we hypothesize, the degree of, this graph actually shows you that the degree of training sessions completed was related to the level that the individual achieved in the breathing sequences that they monitored. And that was, then there was also a direct relationship between the number of sessions that were engaged and the degree of self-compassion that was improved by the training. The relationship between state mindfulness and the degree and the number of training sessions did not achieve significance, but with self-compassion, it did. So in terms of the neurophysiology, we were specifically looking at the network activity with EEG-based scalable measures, and we do source localization of the EEG-based measures to the brain networks that we were interested in, and we're doing it on task in the context of a 2-breath monitoring task. So a single breath monitoring task can get very monotonous, and people can do it almost as an automated behavior. But when you do 2 breaths monitoring at a time, so inhale, exhale, and tap, that can be more of an attentive task. And so people were monitoring this as the basic assessment for about 5 minutes of time, and we're looking at their neurophysiology. So they're also doing this eyes closed. So in human EEG data, eyes closed, the alpha rhythms are the most prominent, as seen here. So about the 10 hertz rhythms are the most prominent rhythms. So we're looking at whether these specific rhythms are being modulated. And then the networks involved are what I talked to you about. The frontoparietal and the cingulopercular networks are the more task-positive, attentive networks, while the DMN is the distracted, irrelevant stimuli-associated network. Here were our results, and in alignment with prior mindfulness studies, we find that specifically the suppression of the default mode network is observed in the well-mind group, whereas the control group does not show this DMN suppression. The FPN and the CON results did not show differences that were significantly different between the 2 groups. And then exploratory analysis of just correlations showed that there was near significant correlation here between the changes in self-compassion that were observed and the changes in the default mode network activity. So the greater suppression observed was related to greater self-compassion improvement. So overall, we found that providing individuals with brief digital mindfulness modules, so just 5 to 10 minutes at a time, can significantly enhance self-compassion as well as state mindfulness abilities. And the duration of training engagement can be important, with greater changes observed with more training engagement. And so if you were to think about the number of sessions, so 5 to 10 minutes per session and up to 60 sessions, this is actually just about overall 5 hours of training. And people who engaged up to that point are the ones who are seeing the maximal benefit. And we see that there's a selective reduction in the default mode network that was related to the changes in self-compassion. So right now, this was our first study with these digital modules. So it's limited by the small sample sizes. They were powered for effect sizes that were greater than 0.5, so which is a clinically meaningful effect size. And those were achieved in the study. So we were powered for the results that we found, but this needs to be replicated in future work. And we also assumed that engaging medical trainees in their early years of training might be more beneficial, given that they might have more time at this point to develop such kind of foundational practices. So with that, I'd like to thank you for being here, and I hope you have a great mindful day.
That's great, Jyoti. Having seen this before, now looking at it again, my question for you is, do you have any idea? There were some people in the waitlist control group whose self-compassion improved, right? So because some of them were driving some of your DMN correlations. Any idea what they might have been doing or what might have been going on in their lives as medical students that helped them to improve their self-compassion without the help of the app?
So they were not, engaging in that. There was no significant group difference, and they weren't engaging with any compassion-related training as such. At the same time, I think these skills are very much state-oriented for that given moment, and that's why we want to have some control groups, so that even practice effects that doing these skills over and over can lead to improvement. So I think that could be one reason we saw changes.
All right. Good morning. I'm Christy Wilson-Mendenhall. I'm a scientist at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And today I'm going to share some ideas that emerged from an interdisciplinary project on visualizing compassion. So my talk today is on an integrative review. So I want to start with a quick roadmap. In part one of the talk, I'm going to motivate a specific hypothesis on visualizing compassion by integrating modern neuroscience. Let me just find there we go. By integrating modern neuroscience, social psychology, and texts on Tibetan Buddhist practices. It was really wonderful to work with John Dunn, who's an expert in Buddhist studies on this project. And may be here. I don't know if I see him. Yeah, there he is. And then in part two, I'll explore how this hypothesis inspires future research on compassion-based interventions. But before getting into these specifics, let's first zoom out to the big picture. Decades of research support what we often have a felt sense of, that social connection, the feelings of connectedness, care, and love that we experience in relationship with one another is essential for mental health and well-being. But not all social interactions have this felt sense of connection. Many people deeply value relationships and social connection, but it can be more difficult in practice in the routine interactions of our day-to-day. And contemplative traditions suggest that we can foster connection with others by intentionally cultivating compassion, with compassion being defined as a benevolent emotional response towards another who is suffering, coupled with the motivation to alleviate their suffering and promote their well-being. So there's growing interest in interventions for developing the skills that support cultivating compassion. Compassion-based interventions share a focus on contemplative practices designed to cultivate compassion for diverse others, and often include cultivating compassion for oneself. And meta-analysis suggests that compassion-based interventions increase prosocial motivation and positive feelings directed towards others. But less is known about how these interventions impact compassion in everyday life. A handful of studies suggest that compassion-based interventions increase prosocial behavior, but we still know very little about the impact of these interventions out in the world. So today I'm going to build on this prior work to consider one pathway through which compassion practices may impact intention and action in everyday life. So I'm going to move into the interdisciplinary integration that addresses this question. And I want to begin with neuroscience. So one of the amazing things about the human brain is our imagination. For example, right now we can close our eyes and imagine sitting at the beach, resting our feet in the warm sand, looking out at the glittering ocean, hearing the waves softly roll in, and feeling our body relax. And many neuroimaging studies now suggest that when we vividly imagine a situation like this, the brain simulates that experience to a degree as if it were actually happening. So we see activity across brain regions involved in sensory experiences like seeing and hearing and touch, and those involved in motor control. And the images that I'm showing here are just one example of this. And so this pattern of sensory motor activity during imagined experience can function to prime us or prepare us to perceive and act similarly out in the world. Immersing in imagined situations can also evoke a strong emotional response. So when we imagine emotional situations, we also see activity in the brain, in brain regions involved in regulating the body and affective experience. And some of those regions are shown here. And our imagination, especially in these emotional situations, is often self-focused. A lovely daydream like being at the beach, or, an anxious worst case scenario. But what if we shifted the focus to caring for others? Could we intentionally use our imagination to cultivate compassion? Based on the neuroscience evidence, we would expect that vividly imagining helping another person establishes a neural pattern that prepares us to behave that way in the world. And social psychology studies suggest that this may be the case, that vividly imagining helping another person increases willingness to help and actual prosocial behavior. So to give you an example, in one study, participants imagined helping a person whose garage had burned down due to a neighbor's fireworks, or they did a control activity that did not involve imagining helping. They were then told that the person was still upset and distressed a few days later and were asked to write a letter of support. And those who had imagined helping wrote longer letters of support. The length of letters also did not differ depending on whether the person whose garage burned down was in a similar in-group or a dissimilar out-group to the participant. So the intergroup bias that is typically observed and was present in the control group in this study was eliminated for those who imagined helping. And when we think about imagining compassion and imagining helping others as a practice, a key insight of Tibetan Buddhist traditions is starting with visualizations involving a loved one, for which it is easier to experience compassion. So in Tibetan texts, these visualizations focus on one's mother. A practitioner first imagines being lovingly cared for by their mother in great sensory detail. And from this place of being loved and cared for, the practitioner then imagines their mother suffering, often in an elderly, weakened state. So to give you one example, one text says, "Your mother is crazed, unable to remain composed. She is blind, has no guide, and stumbles with every step as she approaches a frightful precipice." So in this tradition, imagining this dangerous situation evokes a spontaneous and strong motivation to act, to help your mother, to care for her. And the affective intensity of the imagined experience is a key feature of the practice, including physical indications such as tears. And this felt sense of compassion with a loved one becomes then the experiential foundation for cultivating compassion during imagined situations with diverse others, such as someone the practitioner barely knows or a perceived enemy. And to encourage immersion in these practices, a range of possible situations are typically offered so the practitioner can imagine what will be most effective for themselves. So through this integrative review, we arrived at a hypothesis that vividly imagining acting compassionately may establish neural patterns in the brain that prepare us to behave this way out in the world. In other words, we are simulating an experience during contemplative practice. I'm going to use the term episodic simulation specifically to refer to immersing in an imagined episode, a particular situation. So episodic simulation of the loved one suffering evokes a strong motivation to act compassionately. And from this foundation, episodic simulation is a way to practice engaging with care and compassion in situations we may encounter out in the world. For example, as an educator in a classroom with a disruptive student, or as a nurse or physician at the bedside of a scared patient. And through episodic simulation, we can embody how to engage more compassionately in a familiar situation and explore situations that may be less familiar. So now I'm going to turn to how this hypothesis inspires future research on compassion-based interventions. So again, I'm going to use this term episodic simulation for the rest of the talk. And specifically, I'm using this term to refer again to imagined experience that's characterized by rich sensory detail that constructs the scene and coheres as an episode. So in thinking about future directions, we first specified some of the dimensions of episodic simulations that we think might make it particularly effective in this context, functioning to foster compassion out in the world. So first, we propose that immersive and detailed episodic simulation can induce compassionate feelings of warmth, care, and concern for another. So this is what we saw emphasized in Tibetan practices that anchor on a loved one and invoke strong and spontaneous feelings of compassion. So such feelings can supply the motivation to engage in prosocial behavior and in the face of another's distress to maintain focus on what they are experiencing. Second, we propose that episodic simulation provides an opportunity to consider what a person may believe, feel, want, and need, to practice seeking another person's perspective, to calibrate inferences or guesses one is making about their experiences. So this process of calibrated mentalizing may help identify what actions may be of benefit and decrease the likelihood of avoidance and inaction. And third, through episodic simulation, we can embody engaging with another person to reduce their suffering, to practice taking action. This may instantiate sensory motor patterns in the brain that can prime such behavior in the world, and also may elicit reinforcing affective outcomes, such as what has been described as the warm glow of giving. So we propose quantifying these dimensions of episodic simulation in future research using subjective behavioral neural methods to investigate the degree to which individuals differ along these dimensions and if they mediate prosocial outcomes in compassion-based interventions. We also considered the practice of episodic simulation in compassion-based interventions. So again, a key feature of Tibetan compassion practices is that practitioners fill in personal details to construct imagined simulations that will be especially effective for themselves, that apply to their lives. So a really important question for future research is understanding the balance between guided instruction and this personalization. Language can be a really powerful tool for guided visualizations, but it has to resonate with the practitioner. And as I described earlier, Tibetan compassion practices begin with a loved one because it's relatively easy to fill in personal details and to spontaneously experience compassion during episodic simulation. But it's likely more difficult without guidance to engage in episodic simulation that involves extending care to more distant, unfamiliar others. So I think one implication here is adapting compassion practices for groups who experience similar situations out in the world. It may be of benefit for instruction to guide practitioners through real world situations known to be relevant for them. For example, at the bedside of a scared patient or in the classroom with a disruptive student. And such an approach would benefit from community-engaged intervention development, co-construction of the intervention. For example, in a healthcare setting, developing an intervention in partnership with care providers and a diverse group of patients, such that compassion practices reflect everyone who is potentially impacted by the intervention. This also draws attention to the lived experiences of the instructors and facilitators as well. And as part of considering the practice of episodic simulation, we also considered potential barriers. So certain barriers may make it more difficult to engage in episodic simulation during compassion practices. One possible barrier is this difficulty constructing and immersing in imagined situations. So again, Tibetan compassion practices intentionally anchor on the ease of imagining a loved one. But still, imagining a detailed episode may be challenging. Guided practices might build up to more complex imagery, again, with particular attention to finding language that is intuitive and resonates with the practitioner. And virtual reality is also an intriguing avenue here for engaging and supporting episodic simulation. Another possible barrier is that people may avoid compassion because they lack the confidence to act or perceive it to require too much effort. Engaging in episodic simulation in which taking action successfully reduces another suffering in the imagined situation may actually build confidence. And as an individual practices engaging compassionately with those who are not close others through episodic simulation, it may instantiate a familiarity that increases confidence and decreases perceived effort. Another barrier is feeling fatigued and hopeless from being repeatedly exposed to others' distress, for example, in healthcare and helping professions. And in some instances, episodic simulation may provide a means of approaching a familiar situation differently. It offers a way to practice taking a compassionate stance that does not avoid another person's suffering, nor inhabit it to one's own detriment. And finally, it's difficult to extend care and compassion to others if you do not feel cared for and supported yourself. Building on traditional features of Tibetan practices, some approaches incorporate a receptive mode of practice in which the practitioner immerses in a remembered episode of care and connection to re-experience feeling seen and loved. And I think a really important question for future research here is whether episodic simulation may be a useful tool for nurturing relationships by practicing the complexities of asking for, receiving, and providing care, of balancing one's needs with the needs of others. So it remains an open question whether episodic simulation, particularly in interventions developed for and with specific communities, can address these barriers. In thinking about future directions, we also consider the potential impact of episodic simulation. Based on the simulation hypothesis, in which episodic simulation implicitly primes an individual to act compassionately in the world, we'd expect that the greatest prosocial impact in the real world would be observed in situations that are most similar to those imagined during compassion practices. Repeated practice of episodic simulation may also result in generalizable action repertoires that are useful across a number of situations, such as asking questions to understand how best to support another person. It may also instantiate a type of mental habit of orienting towards others with affiliative intent, especially noticing their suffering and being motivated to figure out what to do instead of succumbing to uncertainty and inaction. And in terms of measuring this impact, one clear implication is assessing experience and behavior out in the world in relevant situations. Again, an advantage of adapting interventions for particular groups is identifying the real world situations in which to measure impact, situations that are regularly encountered and may be challenging, revisiting our examples of bedside care and classroom management. And focusing on relationships and social interactions in the world also draws attention to assessing the experiences of both the practitioner and the individuals presumed to be impacted by the practitioner's actions. And finally, these compassion practices are, of course, one type of contemplative practice, and they reify experience. We are trying to imagine something such that it feels real. Compassion practices may motivate and prepare us to engage in compassionate action, but situations out in the world can be novel and unexpected. What is intended as a compassionate action may not actually reduce another's suffering. So we've been thinking about the balance with mindfulness practices, especially the de-reification dimension of mindfulness. De-reification can help us recognize that our interpretation of a situation is just that, one of many possible interpretations. And skill in de-reification may help us adjust in the real world and be more receptive to others' feedback and perspectives. So if you find these ideas interesting and helpful to your work, this integrative review was recently published. And I'd just like to take a quick moment to thank the reviewers of this paper, which made it a much stronger article. And finally, I want to end by acknowledging that the ideas that I shared today focus on the interpersonal level, but our experiences with each other are also shaped by systems and institutions. As Adrienne Marie Brown writes, who imagined this world? So it is incredibly important to simultaneously consider how we can use our capacity for visualization to reimagine unjust systems, to engage in a collective reimagining. For example, this is one facet of the recent Courage Rise model for building relational cultures of practice. And they write, whether we are conscious of it or not, we are working in service of someone's vision through our actions, our work, and how we spend our money and time. We need tools to reclaim our own future visions and the courage to live into them. Thank you for listening, and thanks to my co-authors, Drs. Dunn and Davidson, and the many wonderful people that I get to work with at the Center for Healthy Minds.
So I've decided that there's time for questions.
Okay.
I just want to tell you, I really think that you're onto something really, I actually think profound. It's very simple. It's like nuanced and not really kind of complicated, but really, it's really very simple. I wanted to get your sense if I'm understanding, which is that you're sort of, are you arguing that there's a kind of fundamental distinction, mechanistically, I guess, between training, linguistically mediated, abstract mental representations of compassionate, sort of like thinking, imagining, being compassionate, versus trying to access that, trying to help a person cultivate that through something that is actually, like you said, memory mediated, episodically mediated, which also then makes it sensory perceptually experienced, and sensory perceptual experience felt compassion.
Yeah.
Which I think is, maybe it's obvious to some folks here who are like, of course, but like, I actually think that if that idea, I don't know. I think certainly it's not so clear to me that that's how we measure the phenomenon. It's also not clear to me that's always how we train it in various kinds of secularized interventions. But I really, it's not often that I hear an idea and I was, oh, that's like a big idea. It's really cool, really cool.
Thank you. Yeah, and that is the idea that this really is, by virtue of how the brain works, we can simulate these experiences through imagined experience. And that sets up patterns that prepare us to act in the world. But the sort of sensory and episodic piece becomes really important in that mechanism. Yeah.
The Christian tradition has a long-standing version of compassion formation that's focused on just this kind of process. And I wondered if you'd be open to studying that tradition.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to talk further about that. You know, I worked with John to really look at the Buddhist traditions, and it was amazing what he pulled out in the texts of these like very sensory descriptions of the practices. And now as I talk to more people, realizing that this is in many traditions actually. And so, yeah, I'd love to talk further about that and think about how this may be a theme across many different kinds of contemplative traditions. All right, thank you.
Hi, my name is Quinn Conklin, and while I'm getting this set up, I am going to invite you all to stand up and move around. It is a big open space and it's really quiet in here, and it will make me less nervous if you all make noise and move around. Okay. Feel free to keep moving around, that's fine. Before I dive in, I want to relay a message from Alyssa Apple, who is listed on the program as the moderator of this session. She sends her love and was sorry that she couldn't be here. And today, I am going to tell you about a project that many of my collaborators and I in this room have been leading. And there is a link up here because you are invited to plug that into any digital device you brought with you and play along at the end of this presentation. There's a little kind of interactive piece. So I'll leave that up there for a moment. I am a postdoc at UC Davis in the lab of Cliff Sarin here. And so the goal of the presentation today is to tell you a little bit about the project, just enough to orient you, and then to show you a few of the tools that we're developing in order to hopefully increase accessibility to the results and the data from this study. So something a little different from the traditional academic article. And let's see here. This is not my computer. There we go. Okay, so the study that we are running, we've called Contemplative Coping during COVID-19. We call it the CCC study for short. And I want to acknowledge the team of folks here. So these are the faces of a lot of the people who have been involved in the design and the running of this study. But I also want to acknowledge many people in the Mind and Life community and in this community who are at this conference who either gave us feedback on the project or helped us recruit people, or in some cases may have even participated in the study. And then also the 389 participants who provided some of the data that you'll be seeing, because these people contributed a lot of time and effort to the questions that we asked of them. And also acknowledge our funders. So the initial seed funding from this came from the Mind and Life Institute, and the funding for the project that I am going to show you today is specifically supported by a Varela Award. We also got major contributions from the Yoga Science Foundation and from the Fetzer Institute and other donors as well. So our central question in this project was can meditation and contemplative training practices protect against stressors that would arise related to the COVID-19 pandemic? And we were designing this study during kind of the initial wave of the pandemic, where we were getting lots of messages from the media about staying 6 feet apart. You can see that in that upper left-hand corner, not touching our face. There was a lot of fear, legitimate fear, but fear happening, and not really sure about how long this would go on, what the impacts of this would be. And then at the bottom, you can see some of the potential things that might support us during these sorts of stressful times. And while we were designing this study, we weren't sure how this was all going to unfold, but it was pretty apparent from the outset that the stressors people face were going to be different, and the effects of the pandemic were going to land differently for different people. So in true Sarin lab fashion, we collected 1 million different constructs and questionnaires. So internally, we kind of call these the primary questionnaires and the secondary questionnaires. And the primary means like, what would have been a reasonable study? And then everything else is all the things we added on top of that. And so in the primary questionnaires, we asked people many questions about what was going on for them related to COVID, what kind of disruptions they were experiencing, how they were feeling about things, how much they were tracking different changes, and how it was potentially affecting people in their lives. We also took a really extensive history of their meditation experience. So we collected questions both from our prior studies and from other labs. Specifically, we asked Richie Davidson for some of the questions he uses and Willoughby Britton for some of the questions they use. So we had a really extensive set of meditation questions. And then we used some self-report instruments related to constructs of mental health and well-being. So perceived stress, anxiety, depression, PTSD, loneliness, social connectedness, resilience, flourishing, and post-traumatic growth. So that's the first set of things people would have done in this study. We also designed something called these are all made up names that we use internally, but the weekly inventory and journaling exercise. So we wanted to also get measures of things that we thought would fluctuate more frequently for people, things like their emotional experiences, exercise, sleep, daily life events. And we had a qualitative component to this because we wanted to hear from people in their own words what the stressful experiences they were having were and what the supportive experiences that they were having were. So I'm already spending more time here than I expected, so I'm gonna move along a little bit. The secondary questionnaires were a lot more constructs that we thought would be potentially individual measures that might be predictive of how people experienced the ongoing pandemic and things that might be related to meditation practice, things that might be trained or moved by meditation practice. And then I want to just point to this bottom corner here. We also tried to take what we hope is a fairly comprehensive inventory of different types of adversity and stressors people had experienced over their lifetime leading up to that, to kind of assess where people were going into this stressful experience. We also sent people these kits to collect their own blood sample at home to be used to measure telomere length. So a lot of our work, my kind of focus has been on looking at the relationship between stress and telomere length and whether or not meditation practice can move that relationship around. So this was a year-long longitudinal study. We assessed people every 4 months for a year, and they completed these self-report questionnaires at each of those time points and were invited to send back a blood sample at the first and last of those 4 time points. Here, I just want to point out the baseline assessment actually took place over a whole month. So they did those primary questionnaires right away, and then we had them fill out the weekly inventories once a week for 4 weeks. So that initial assessment took place over an entire month. Participants enrolled in this study on a rolling basis from June until December. And so I'm kind of unpacking this because eventually we want you to be able to explore some of these data on your own. And there's a lot of quirky features to the timing of this because people would have responded at different points. And if any of you remember 2020, it changed every day in big ways. The landscape was really shifting very rapidly. So we recruited people between June and December of 2020. And that baseline assessment took place from June until January. And I want to also acknowledge some of the other major events that were happening during that time. So it wasn't just that we were navigating this pandemic, but that there was also other really disruptive events taking place. And specifically, I want to call attention to George Floyd's murder, because that paused, the world paid attention in a way that I just want to call attention to the fact that the rates of killing by the police have not changed, but that moment sort of drew attention in a way that's not happening right now. So Tyree Nichols was killed 3 weeks ago, and there's a very different climate happening right now than there was at that point. So I want to draw attention to that because it did play into how we conducted the study and how we shifted the study. And there's a big gap in what's happening right now, I think. But also there was the political stuff happening, the presidential election. So there were a lot of shifting foci throughout this period. And I will also mention that part of what we did to shift our strategies was to hire Dr. Camila Majid, who many of you have met here probably, and to change some of our recruitment materials and the study materials as well. So that's another factor to consider while we interpret these data. People who joined at different points in the study would have seen slightly different things throughout the unfolding of this. I won't spend a ton of time talking about how we changed those materials. It's something I'm happy to talk with people about, but I just want to put some attention on some of the folks who really sort of had pivotal roles in our redesign. And the focus of what I was intending to tell you here today was specifically on considering some of the things we can do to improve inclusion at different stages of the research cycle. That sounded very weird to me, but so right now we're focusing specifically on how we're interpreting that data and disseminating the data. So again, this particular project was supported by a Mind and Life Varela Award. And there are two things that we have sort of developed so far, one of which is individual reports looking at the specific instruments that we've used and starting to explore some of those. Another that I directed you to at the beginning is a little shiny app where we can start to look at relationships between the different variables and explore those sorts of things. So in these individual reports, we describe what each of the instruments is, how it gets scaled or scored and used and interpreted. We provide some of the descriptive statistics for those things, and have created a number of different visualizations so you can see some of the variability in the data. And also, that's much louder. Everyone hearing me okay? I'm kind of leaning in and out. Okay. So one of the things we're doing in these tools is to also provide some directives and schematics about how to interpret these different types of visualizations, because even researchers who generate these and create these may not be familiar with all the different types, but we're hoping that by providing some resources, people who are not necessarily researchers who do these sorts of things can also kind of interpret and access these data. And we're looking at things in different ways. So I mentioned that our collection period ran for quite a while, from June until January. And so we also then had different waves of assessing people because it was longitudinal. So what you see here is the 4 different time points, but also shown over time. And so you can see kind of the different patterns according to the phases of the study. What I failed to mention here entirely is that we're looking at perceived stress as the example. I'm solely focusing on one variable for now, just to kind of illustrate the different measures here, or the different visualizations. But you can see that it sort of does, there are some trends that are potentially seasonal too, that might maybe seasonal, but maybe just those different events that were happening throughout the year. We can also see if you score the perceived stress and bin people into the different categories of what's considered a cutoff for high, moderate, or low stress. We see that most folks, or the most predominant category in this study were low stress, but that people were shifting between these different time points, and you can kind of see the proportion of people who move between these different categories. And then this is called a corset plot. And what you can see here is that there are lots of individual changes. And between these two time points, from the first to second time point, we have almost the exact same number of people decreasing in perceived stress as increasing in perceived stress. So there's a ton of variability here. So then I will quickly guide you through the Shiny app. And so this is very, very preliminary. This is my very first idea of what to do with these data and where to start. But the goal of showing it to you now is to start to have conversations with people about what sorts of relationships they'd be most interested in and how this could be made more useful. So I will skip through pretty quickly, but we have interactive maps, so you can start to see where people in this study came from, different demographic breakdowns of the participants in the study, and then what you see here is relationships between meditation variables on the x-axis and some construct related to well-being on the y-axis. And the options along the left, you can choose to change those variables, and you can do things like add regression lines and look at the different statistics, the correlations between these measures. You can choose different well-being measures, you can choose different meditation measures, and also look at that with different demographic categories represented. We've also shown the different time points, so you can start to look at whether or not these relationships are consistent across time points or if they differ. And then there's some correlation maps there. And one of the things that I find interesting here is just that of all the things that I listed out of those mental health well-being constructs, they're all very interrelated except post-traumatic growth. That one is not correlated with any of these measures. So I'll just end with acknowledging Jen Pokorny. She is the data scientist and lab member who is creating the Shiny apps and visualizations. And this was really motivated by her intention to do something different. Yeah. I will also say that this is something I would love to have discussions with people about. Are you doing things like this? We also intend to give participants some of their data back, and that's an area that is new terrain and interesting. So excited to talk to people who have done anything of that nature.
Thank you so much. We did a study of older adults during the pandemic where we were measuring a lot of similar things. So it'd be really great to be able to access some of these. So my question is a little self-serving, but what are you, it sounds like great open science. Are there any guardrails that you're putting on it? Like, are there, do you need to kind of register with you to sort of say, we want to look at this thing just to make sure that nobody else has already looked at this thing? Or how does the data sharing actually work for the study?
That's a great question and something that I meant to address. We're in an interesting space here because partly in terms of wanting to move quickly at the start of the pandemic and kind of launch into this, I don't think we necessarily thought through all of these steps at that point. You know, it was a quick launch. And we didn't include a data sharing clause in the in the consent form. And so as of right now, we can share in this format of this aggregate presentation we cannot share the raw data. And so that is actually part of the in-between space I sort of want to inhabit here, because there's a certain level of, one, we didn't necessarily give the participants the option to say, yes, I'm fine with my data being shared, or no, I don't want to. And that's something we're moving toward, maybe an additional consent form so that we can do that if people want to share their data. But kind of preserving the privacy of the participants, but also trying to make as much of the data available in this sort of in-between space of, so most of this wouldn't necessarily make it into a published journal article to the degree that we can present it in a tool like this. And so there's sort of a pre-digestion step, if you will, so that we can make data available for things like meta-analyses and that sort of thing. But that being said, there's a lot of room for collaboration in terms of, if you want to look at certain things that we might have, there's space there too. Anything else? Thank you.